My name is Alfredo Artiles. I'm going to be chairing this presidential session. I want to welcome everyone to this session titled The Need for Evidence-Based Understanding of Immigration and Its Consequences. And the session focuses on what has been described as the demographic imperative and its consequences. The population characteristics of the US are changing dramatically. The majority origin population is expected to continue to decline, while those from immigrant backgrounds are expected to increase. One of the biggest challenges educational researchers face in the 21st century is to produce evidence that dispels many of the myths surrounding immigration, such as that migrants are attracted to the US by generous public benefits or that immigrants intend to settle permanently in the US. Another crucial challenge for education researchers is to pay systematic attention to the sociocultural assets and needs of these growing communities, with an eye on the rich diversity represented within each of them. There is a wealth of evidence showing how the changing demographic is having a significant impact in schools, where questions regarding the quality of education immigrant students receive is of major concern. Research indicates that many immigrant children are failing to gain the skills and knowledge that will lead them to educational achievement, economic security, civic engagement, and social and emotional well-being. Schools and communities have been cited as non-responsive to the needs of immigrant students. Immigration is indeed one of the most complex and misunderstood issues in the education field today. And this distinguished panel, for this reason, will discuss what the evidence tells us about the changes in our US population and the implications it is likely to have for immigrant children. Our distinguished presenters will cover complexities related to immigration policies, families and their dynamic cultural practices, and civic engagement among immigrant children. I'm going to introduce each of the panelists next, and then each of them will just take their turn to have a better flow, and we'll leave time for Q&A at the end of the session. The first presenter is Professor Doug Massey. He's Henry G. Bryan Professor of Sociology and Public Affairs with a joint appointment in the Woodrow Wilson School, a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Society. He's the current president of the American Academy of Political and Social Science and is a member of the Council of the National Academy of Sciences and co-editor of the Annual Review of Sociology. He currently serves as director of the Office of Population Research. Massey's research focuses on international migration, race and housing, discrimination, education, urban poverty, stratification, and Latin America, especially Mexico. He's the author, most recently, of Brokered Boundaries, Constructing Immigrant Identity in Anti-Immigrant Times, co-authored by Magali Sanchez and published by the Russell Sage Foundation. The next presenter is Professor Roberto Gonzalez. He's Assistant Professor of Education at Harvard University. His research focuses on how legal and educational institutions shape the everyday experiences of poor, minority, and immigrant youth along the life course. Over the last decade, Professor Gonzalez has been engaged in critical inquiry regarding what happens to undocumented children, immigrant children, as they make his transitions to adolescence and young adulthood. He's currently completing a book manuscript based on a study of undocumented young adults in Los Angeles, and in the second year of a 5-year study to assess the effects of widened access among beneficiaries of the DACA program. His work is being supported by MacArthur, Irvine, and Hazen Simons Foundations. The third presenter is Professor Joanna Dreby. She is Assistant Professor of Sociology at SUNY Albany, received her PhD from CUNY Graduate Center in 2007. She's author of the award-winning book, Divided by Borders, Mexican Migrants and Their Children, published by University of California Press, and is co-editor of Family and Work in Everyday Ethnography, published by Temple University Press. Her current research focuses on the impacts of enforcement policies on families. Her recent article, The Burden of Deportation on Children and Mexican Immigrant Families, in the Journal of Marriage and Family, received the Best Paper Award from the International Migration section of the American Sociological Association. The last presenter is Dr. Veronica Terriquez. She's Assistant Professor in Sociology at the University of Southern California. She received her PhD in Sociology from UCLA her master's in education at Berkeley, and her BA in sociology from Harvard. Her work examines how demographic characteristics, along with civic and organizations, schools, and other institutions, shaped the incorporation of immigrants and their descendants. As part of this broad research agenda, she's conducted studies that primarily focus on immigrant parents' civic engagement in schools and transitions to adulthood among the children of immigrants. Dr. Tarikas is affiliated to the USC Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration and the UCLA Institute for Democracy, Education, and Access. We'll also have a discussant in this session. Professor Howard Chan will be serving in this role. He's the Earl Hepburn Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, where he teaches and writes about immigration law. He's also been a law professor at the University of Southern California, a visiting professor at Georgetown University, Stanford University, Harvard, NYU, the University of Michigan, and the University of Chicago, and a law clerk for Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg. He received his JD from Harvard Law School, PhD in economics from MIT, master's in public affairs from Princeton, and AB in government from Harvard College. Please join me in welcoming our panelists.
In 1970, Latinos were 4.7% of the US population. They were spatially divided and not a national population, consisting of Mexican Americans in the Southwest, overwhelmingly in Texas and California, all of whom were citizens or children of immigrants or immigrants, legal immigrants. Puerto Ricans in the northeastern United States, particularly New York and its environs, all of whom were by definition citizens. And Cubans in South Florida who were very recently arrived in the first and very young second generations, and all of whom were welcomed with open arms as refugees from communist tyranny on the island. Fast forward to 2010, Latinos are 17% of the population. Among births in the year 2011, 25% were to Latina mothers. The population is now a national population in all 50 states. And it is heavily undocumented. Undocumented migration rose to be a characteristic phenomenon of the Latino population, to the point where mass illegality is now the single most important barrier to Latino progress and integration in this country. And I want to talk about how we got into this state of affairs, where 11 million people are out of status, and 60% of all Mexican immigrants present in the United States lack documents, and 2/3 to 3/4 of all Central American immigrants present in the United States lack documents and lack any social, economic, or civic right in this country. I've been studying immigration for 35 years now, and it took me a long time to finally realize that when Congress makes immigration policy, it doesn't make immigration policy based on its actual knowledge or understanding of immigration. And really policy has nothing to do with immigration. If you look at American immigration policy, it tells you more about the hopes and aspirations of Americans or the fears and apprehensions of Americans. In 1965, it was all about hopes and aspirations. In 1965 was the height of the civil rights movement. We passed the Civil Rights Act in 64, the Voting Rights Act in 65, and in the context of a real move to deracialize American public policy, the old discriminatory national origins quotas that were put in place in the 1920s came to be seen as intolerable. And to reflect our hopes and aspirations for a new and better society, the Johnson administration and key leaders in Congress pushed to overhaul immigration law and eliminate the tinge of racism from the immigration system. And to do this, they basically scrapped the old quotas that had kept out Southern and Eastern Europeans, read Russian Jews, Italian Catholics, and Polish Catholics. And they were aided in this affair by the fact that by 1965, Peter Rodino was in charge of the Judiciary Committee in the House, and Dan Rostenkowski was in charge of the Ways and Means Committee in the House, and they were all bent out of shape of the way the immigration policies had treated their parents. So the Congress scrapped the national origins quotas, put in place a new system that allocated visas by labor needs and family connections to the United States, and set up what they saw as a neutral 20,000 per country visa system, 20,000 visas per country per year, to replace the old national origins quotas. And a lot of people say, oh, this, and they scrapped the bans on African and Asian immigration that had been in place for many, many, many decades. Many people look at the 1965 Immigration Act and say, well, this brought about this tremendous change in immigration to the United States and a shift away from European origins to Latin and Asian origins. And the Asian part is certainly true. Lifting the ban on Asian immigration did have a big effect. But when it comes to Latin American immigration, it's precisely the opposite. Because what the 1965 reforms did was put the first ever numerical limitations on Latin American immigration to the United States. Prior to 1965, there was no numerical limit on immigration from any country in the Western Hemisphere. And in 1968, they phased in a 120,000 per year quota on Western Hemisphere migration. And by 1976, the Western Hemisphere had been folded into the worldwide system of 20,000 visas per country per year. Now, Congress did this without really thinking about what was happening on the ground in 1965 at that point. And if you look at what was happening was, and entries from Mexico were running at about 50,000 per year, permanent resident aliens entering from Mexico. And in the late 1950s, there was a guest worker program in place that brought in about 450,000 Mexican workers entering per year. So we were taking in around 500,000 Mexicans per year mostly in temporary status, but with legal visas, and about 50,000 permanent residents. Well, just after, in 1965, Congress also scrapped the temporary worker program because it was seen as an exploitive labor program, which of course it probably was, and it came to be seen as akin to Southern sharecropping in the South. And so these reforms were all done in the name of civil rights. The immigration reform bill was really not an immigration bill, it was a civil rights bill. But nobody in Congress really thought about what would happen to this flow, this well-established flow of 500,000 people per year entering the United States from Mexico when you cut off the guest worker program and you cut off access to permanent resident visas. And the answer is nothing really happened except you change the status of the people entering. After 1965, the flows quickly reestablished themselves except under undocumented auspices. And as undocumented migration rose, it provided political entrepreneurs and bureaucratic entrepreneurs in the United States an ideal opportunity to frame the migration from south of the border as a threat to the United States. And you see the rise of the Latino, what Leo Chavez at UC Irvine calls the Latino threat narrative, where Latinos are framed by politicians and bureaucrats in the government as a grave threat to the nation. And this is easy because they're illegal migrants and by definition, therefore, criminals and lawbreakers. And the trope of illegality works into public rhetoric to frame immigration from Mexico, in particular and Latin America more generally, as a serious threat to the nation. You see a rise in two sets of metaphors. The first was a marine metaphor where undocumented migrants were flooding into the United States, going to drown American culture, inundate our society, and so on. And over time, the flood metaphor gave way to a more prominent use of martial metaphors, an alien invasion from south of the border, an occupying army in the United States. Border Patrol officers were outgunned defenders holding the line at the border against bonsai charges of desperate migrants from the south. And all these became very common tropes which is a demonstrable fact, in American media. And this drove a new emphasis on the border and on border enforcement. First, under the guise of the Cold War, where during the Sandinista period, Latin American immigrants were framed as a fifth column of communists coming into the country. And if you don't believe me, go watch the movie Red Dawn from that period. And then later, after 2000, really in the late 90s, and especially after 2001, after 9/11, they became conflated with the war on terror and came to be seen as a threat to the security of the United States. I testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee once, and Chuck Schumer, theoretically a liberal Democrat, gets up and says the Mexico-U.S. border is the front line in the war on terror, which is absurd on the face of it, but that's the rhetoric inside Washington. So this drove, especially after 1986 and accelerating dramatically during the 1990s, militarization of the Mexico-U.S. border. As more and more resources were poured along the Mexico-U.S. border, more and more Border Patrol officers, more and more equipment, more and more materiel. The Border Patrol's budget goes from about $200 million per year up to about $3.5 billion per year. The Border Patrol goes from 2,000 officers to a current 21,000 officers. The Border Patrol becomes the largest arms-bearing branch of the U.S. government, save the military itself. Well, what happens when you militarize the border? When you militarize the border, you do not deter people from coming in. You change their behavior dramatically. You drive up the costs of border crossing. You drive up the risks of border crossing. But as long as the magnet of employment is available on the U.S. side of the border, and there's an incentive to move, they pay the costs and they experience the risks and they come into the United States. What happens when you militarize the border is that you deter migration back to Mexico, so that having paid the costs and risks of migration and experienced the dangerous conditions along the border, rather than going back at the end of the season or at the end of a period of work to come back again and face those risks and costs the next year, you hunker down and stay. So during the 90s and early 2000s, Mexico-U.S. migration was transformed from a circular flow of male workers going to 3 states into a settled population of families living in 50 states. And the proportion of undocumented migrants actually expanded dramatically. So during the 90s, we were spending $3 to $4 billion per year in order to double the net rate of undocumented migration to the United States. If you, there's a simple equation in demography: net migration equals in-migration minus out-migration. If you impose a dramatic militarization of the border that has little or no effect on in-migration but dramatically reduces out-migration, the net migration must increase arithmetically. And that's exactly what happened. So it wasn't the vast inflow of undocumented migrants into the United States and the transformation of the Latino population into a population of mixed status with a huge chunk of people living out of status and even more people connected to people living out of status did not happen because more people were entering the United States. It happened because fewer people were leaving the United States. And the entire growth of the undocumented population was a complete and total function of U.S. immigration and border policy. So that's how we got into the circumstances we find ourselves now. And Congress keeps throwing more and more punitive measures against the immigrant population, stripping away rights not only of undocumented migrants, who didn't have rights in the first place, but increasing them against all non-citizens, whether they're legal resident aliens or temporary visa holders or whatever. It's increasing pressure against this population, typified most particularly by the mass increase in deportations. We are currently deporting around 400,000 people per year on an ongoing basis, about 300,000 of whom are deportations to Mexico. So the Saudi pilots flew the planes into the towers on 9/11, and to show Al-Qaeda how tough we are, we deport our Latinos. So this is the sad, ironic state of affairs that prevails right now. And we're at a unique crossroads. In 2008, with the onset of the recession and dramatic shifts in conditions on both sides of the border that have been accumulating for many years, undocumented migration went negative and on a net basis, and the undocumented population fell from about 12 to 11 million. Since 2009, it's held steady at roughly 11 million. Undocumented migration is zero or negative at this point, which of course is why Congress keeps calling for more and more border enforcement. Ironically, we're at a position now where 3 of the 4 pillars of immigration reform have already been satisfied. Get the border under control is always number 1. Well, it's been zero net migration for 5 years now. I think we've got the border under control. It's the most controlled border anywhere in the world with the exception of the Korean DMZ. Second, create a guest worker program. Well, Congress quietly, through a variety of mechanisms, has steadily raised access to temporary work visas. And in 2008, 350,000 Mexicans entered with temporary work visas. And that's the largest number since the Bracero program in the late 1950s. And third, expand the quotas for Mexico and Canada, our trading partners in NAFTA, as we integrate all the markets in North America. Well, Mexicans have done this themselves by taking out citizenship in record numbers. And in response to congressional pressure against non-citizens, Mexicans have been naturalizing in large numbers. And whenever a Mexican naturalizes, they gain rights to enter under the U.S. immigration system. So the only thing left in immigration reform is a pathway to legalization, a legalization of the 11 million people currently out of status, 3 million of whom are people who entered as children and no other country really than the United States. And that is the big challenge for educators today. How to deal with these mixed status families, how to deal with this large undocumented population that was largely manufactured by our own misplaced border and immigration policies.
So I'm a bit short. So I'm thrilled to be here and really happy to be on a panel with folks that I really, whose work that I really admire and folks that I really like. So what I want to do is to draw a smaller circle, but what I also want to do is pick up on a lot of where Doug left off. In fact, if this was a relay race with a baton, he handed the baton to me in stride. So a lot of Doug's work is foundational, and particularly the last part of it, for understanding why we have a settled population of 2.1 to 3 million undocumented immigrants who've been here since childhood. And that is that the growth of the settled undocumented population, a population that, because it became a lot more costly, a lot more dangerous, and a lot more difficult to cross, brought their families. And so what you see through the early to mid-90s on is the growth of the number of children who will grow up in this country without legal immigration status. So over the last probably 5 or so years, the academic community has made great strides in understanding the untenable circumstances of these children who grow up in the U.S. Without legal immigration status, and what happens to them as they make difficult transitions through adolescence and young adulthood. Over the last probably dozen years, I've been looking at this question of what happens to these children as they make these difficult transitions. I've just finished up a 10-year study in Los Angeles following about 150 undocumented young people who've been in the U.S. since 12. And we're wrapping up the first year of a study to look at the Deferred Action Program. we surveyed about 2,700 DACA-eligible young adults, and almost 24 of them with DACA. And the next phase of that project is to look at a smaller number of states, Arizona, California, Florida, Georgia, New York, and Illinois, and to look at the ways in which local contexts are mediating this national policy. But I want to talk first about policy and advocacy efforts. So probably over the last 5 years, the plight of the undocumented immigrant student has gained increased visibility in the media and in Congress. And we have been presented with stories, countless stories of valedictorians, class presidents, debate team captains, very high achievers that despite their legal circumstances have done very well to achieve a great amount in this country. This campaign has been a winning campaign in certain respects. This DREAM Act campaign has won the endorsements of university presidents, of business leaders, of our elected officials, celebrities, our president, and even more celebrities. It's also been successful in terms of moving states to pass tuition equity laws. And so to date, 19 states have passed bills to allow undocumented immigrant students to pay in-state tuition. And with the state of Washington recently, 4 states now offer state financial aid. I would also attribute the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA policy, as a result of this DREAM Act campaign. So what this frame has said is that undocumented young people who are really great achievers, so are model citizens in our communities, model students in our schools, right, are being denied the opportunity to access education, higher education, and get good jobs. 2 really important issues. However, this campaign has come short when we look at the entirety of the experiences. And so as a result, what we're finding now, especially with DACA, is that a lot of the problems that have existed have really gone unnoticed because of the almost exclusive focus on higher education. So I want to talk a little bit about that. So looking at the bigger picture. So what we know about DACA so far, of an eligible population between 1.4 and 1.8 million, those who are immediately eligible for the Deferred Action Program, about 610,000 young people have applied, leaving anywhere between a half and 2/3 who haven't applied. 521,000 or more have been approved for DACA. So there's a large segment of this population that has not applied. So our new study of the almost 2,700, a little more than, I guess a little shy of 2,400 of our respondents have received DACA. These young people have immediately taken advantage of DACA, getting new driver's licenses, new jobs, paid internships, opening bank accounts, credit cards. 2/3 of these young people are less afraid now of law enforcement, and another 2/3 are less afraid of being deported. But as I mentioned earlier, many other problems remain. So a couple months ago, the New York Times came out with an article about this problem of this big segment of this DACA/DREAM Act eligible population that hasn't come forward. So DACA, for those who don't know, offers the opportunity for a work permit, 2-year stay of deportation, and depending on what state you live in, driver's licenses and other important benefits. Yet, a large segment of this population has not applied. In 2010, the Migration Policy Institute came up with some estimates that if the DREAM Act were to pass then, their estimates were only about 38% of this eligible population, about 825,000, would likely obtain legal permanent residence because of educational and other barriers. So in our larger sample, we've got a subsample of about 250 young people who haven't applied, and this is what we found out. No big surprises, right? That many of them have not applied because they can't afford the $465 fee. Many others are waiting for better options, but there's a whole other host of problems: missing paperwork, legal concerns that really dissuade people from coming forward, a lack of trust in the government, don't know how to apply, don't meet the educational requirements, and have left the U.S. at some point in the last 5 years, pointing to really larger problems and problems that affect the entirety of their families. So this larger population, so missing from this larger debate about the DREAM Act, and really from advocates, is that this larger segment of this larger undocumented population faces cumulative disadvantages. And so what does it mean to grow up in a family that's living in poverty? What does it mean to grow up in a household with one or more members, adult members that are undocumented, long separations from parents due to many hours away, spending in low-wage jobs and away from the family, parents avoiding important institutions because of their legal status, housing instability. So what does it mean to move multiple times during the course of one's childhood and adolescence, switching schools? And what does it mean to live in a poor neighborhood and to go to attend very large, overcrowded schools, where if you're not a straight A student, you are left to fend for yourself with the general school population. So these young people face what I call the transition to illegality, and that is, so moving from K through 12 schools where participation is free and legal, right? So moving through critical adolescent and adult rites of passage, right? As friends are moving forward, getting driver's licenses, getting first jobs, going on to college, getting financial aid, starting careers, meeting each other after work for drinks, many of these young people stay stuck. And as their options start to shrink, right, moving into adulthood, their responsibilities to care for their parents and to pitch in at home increase. So as a result, waking up to a nightmare, succession of blocked opportunities, fear, stigma, changed social patterns, not knowing anymore who you can trust, who you can tell your story to, forced decisions every day, and physical and emotional manifestations of stress. What I've learned in talking to what I call college goers and early exiters, young dreamers who exited the school system at or before high school graduation, the majority of this population, is that what does it mean in Los Angeles, for example, when you are undocumented, you're going through a very tough time. We think about adolescence and all the difficulties of adolescence, and layer on top of that exclusion and stigma and all of what is going on as a result of being undocumented. It's a very, very turbulent time. So what does it mean if when you go to a school, let's say Belmont High School in Los Angeles. Belmont High School at its height, 5,400 students at Belmont High School. So what does it mean when you are not in a positive track, when you are in a classroom with a teacher-to-student ratio of 1 to 30, 1 to 35, 1 to 40? California student-to-teacher ratios are of the worst. So what does it mean when you are in a school with a student-to-teacher ratio of 950 to 1? you're not in an AP class, you're not in GATE, you're not an international baccalaureate, but you're left to fend for yourself, and you've been instructed by your parents not to air dirty laundry. As a result, not having access to key resources in school is really, really detrimental to a lot of the trajectories of the vast majority of undocumented immigrant youth. As opposed to the high achievers that I've talked to over the years, in my LA study, of my college goers, all of them could name at least 3 mentors in their lives, in their high school years. So what does it mean to grow up in supportive environments in school, to have unique access to teachers and counselors, a positive peer network, and access to these resources? So moving seamlessly from high school to post-secondary education, developing a strong sense of belonging, right, forming positive networks, and acquiring the tools that one needs to succeed. Nevertheless, DACA has not addressed the issue of financial aid, and the financing post-secondary education remains a huge, huge burden for undocumented students. So undocumented students are still barred from federal financial aid. In a handful of states in the South, in addition to Arizona and other places, there are exclusionary state laws that bar them from public institutions and bar them from being eligible for in-state tuition. But also on the college campuses, bureaucratic and other financial barriers make college matriculation and persistence very difficult. Right? In a lot of the cases, having to work, having to support parents, and having to help pay the bills, work often crowds out time for school. And so what you see with a lot of these young people is that college has become this revolving door. And so you see the phenomena of stopping out, of leaving college to come back. Among our population, our DACA sample, 42%, a little over 42% of the college-going folks have stopped out at least one time. So that's a huge number. So I'm out of time. My wife teases me that I talk a lot and I talk really slow, but I'd be happy in the Q&A to discuss implications. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you for passing the baton on to me, and I'm going to narrow our focus a little bit further with my comments. So about 15 years ago, I was living and working in a new Mexican immigrant community in central New Jersey, not all that far from here. Many of the parents I knew had actually left their children in Mexico when they came to work in the US. I decided I really needed to learn more about what separations meant for parents and for children and for their caregivers in Mexico. I did a multi-sided ethnographic study between 2003 and 2006, and I sort of decided that family separation was one of the unintended consequences of immigration policies that Doug Massey has just outlined for us. For parents, the prospect to work in the US, coupled by the increased militarization at the border, meant temporary separations actually kind of made some sense. Men could not go back to Mexico as frequently or as easily as they may have in the past, and women also wanted to work. So they came north, found jobs alongside men, and left children with grandparents until parents could carve out enough of a foothold in order to send for them. Although this strategy, of course, has a little bit of a logic to it, it was very much a heart-wrenching experience. The 45 parents I interviewed, especially mothers, grappled with guilt. The 60 children, ages 5 and up, who I spoke with, were resentful. And 37 caregivers, mostly grandparents, who I interviewed, talked about many of the conflicts between parents and children during these periods of separation. Through field work with families over 4 years, I learned that expectations of parents had for their children and vice versa were often left unmet. Parent-child relationships were permanently altered by experiences of separation. Now, over the past 10 years, the current immigration system, from my perspective, has even further solidified. Pathways to legalization have become even more difficult for parents that I know, and enforcement efforts have stepped up, with resources being poured into the border, but also within the United States. Deportations have increased, as we know, under the Obama administration, and this benchmark of 400,000 people to be deported per year really has an impact. In my second ethnographic study I completed between 2009 and 2012 in New Jersey and Ohio, I found out that legal status has accrued many impacts for families, sometimes regardless where they live. The 91 parents I interviewed described rapidly changing circumstances. They're raising their children, most of whom are US citizens, from the increasingly precarious situation of being long-term unauthorized migrants. And the 110 children I interviewed described acute awareness of legal status. So if 10 years ago, the tightening of restrictive immigration policies meant that families considered temporary separations divided by borders, today enforcement practices targeting those without legal status now potentially divide families while they're living together in the United States. So my research actually doesn't analyze pedagogy, school structure, educational practice, nothing like that. But I'm here today because I actually have spent a lot of time in children's schools in both of these studies. I went to the schools of children in Mexico who were living without their parents. And I did more structured observations in the schools of children in Mexican families in both New Jersey and Ohio. Most of the time, though, I've been focusing on family environments. So aside from interviews, I've done more long, pointed observations in children's home visits with children and parents, hanging out with them on the weekends and in the evenings. And I've thought a lot about how these environments impact children's lives outside of the home. So I'm going to focus my comments in what follows on how these family-level experiences interface when children are in their school environments. So I'm going to start with the educational experiences of children growing up in Mexico without their parents, and these are the 4 themes I'll cover, and then I'll move to the experiences of children in US schools. And I am putting up a number of quotes in what follows. I'm not going to read everything, so please read them as I go along. That's for time. Living apart, parents and children often felt quite sad about the absence of the symbolic head of the family. Expressing this sadness, Jasenia, a mother I interviewed in New Jersey, said, "I feel bad about my son in Mexico. Sometimes sadness overcomes me and I feel like crying. I have my 2 children here, but it isn't the same." When she spoke with her son over the phone, however, she didn't talk about how sad she felt. Instead, she rationalized the reasons for their separation. But she learned from the caregivers of her son, her aunt and her mother, that he also felt very sad. At school, he writes poems, she told me. My aunt said she found them. She found the papers from May 10th, which is Mother's Day, and from the Day of the Child, and he writes that he feels sad and he feels alone. He wants to tell his mom that he feels alone and that he loves her, but when I talk to him, he doesn't tell me about this. So for many children, the sadness is not only expressed through school assignments, as it was in this case, but it also has an impact on school performance. Brian, a boy I interviewed in the 10th grade, said that after his mother left, he didn't feel like studying anymore. Another 15-year-old told me that after her father left, she had trouble focusing on tests in school. I had nothing in my head. Some children can bounce back from these episodes and get used to it and do relatively well in school. But for other children, the sadness after a parent leaves has long-term ramifications. One boy, who's 17 when I interviewed him, dropped out of school a year after his father left when he was 12. I asked him what happened. Did you want to go live with your father? He said, no, I missed him, but I didn't want to go live in the US. I just didn't feel like studying anymore. Aside from sadness and apathy about schooling, families describe many children of US migrants as becoming troublemakers while their parents are away. One girl at age 13 admitted that she hung out with the wrong crowd at school. She said, I just started hanging out with friends who have lots of problems, just like me. She started to cut classes and was nearly suspended in the middle of the year. Interestingly, the perception that the children of U.S. migrants were troublemakers was really widespread. So the teachers and the administrators I met talked about these kids, saying they're rebels, they're the ones without discipline, they're aggressive, they're violent, they have low grades. So the behavioral difficulties that some children of U.S. migrants were magnified, really, resulting in the perception that all children of U.S. migrants were difficult students. A related problem for children in Mexico is the lack of academic support from caregivers. Mostly this is because the caregivers are grandparents who have very low levels of formal education. The gap between the generations, explained a high school social worker, is very thick. The children of migrants I met rarely felt they had enough support from their caregivers in Mexico for school. Brian, for example, told me that after his mother left, he had nobody to sign his papers from school, so he signed them himself. He was one of the few kids I met who actually was doing pretty well in school, so I asked him what he did to understand the material and who he went to for help. He said, "Nobody. I understand it on my own." So for both parents and children, these years living apart weigh heavily. Family reunification promises to fix the problem, right? But I've also found that resentment clings to children even after they've been reunited with their parents, creating many difficulties for young people as they transition to schools in the US. Under the worst case scenarios, these disruptions can lead to a permanent derailment of a child's education. So I want to tell you about Silvio as a case in point. He lived in Oaxaca for 4 years with his sister and an aunt, and then his parents sent for them after they saved enough money to bring them. Describing Silvio when he arrived in New Jersey, his mother said, at school he adapted pretty well, but at home he became rebellious because, quote unquote, we had abandoned him. His father told me how he cried uncontrollably nearly every night, and he had suicidal thoughts. He said he was going to get a knife and cut himself and hurt himself and his siblings. It's pretty drastic. His mother goes on to say, well, sometimes he didn't do well. When he was mad at me, he would say, I'm going to get all Fs, and he did. Then he'd say, don't worry, Mom, I'm going to do well again, and then he'd bring home A's and B's. I think in this case, the connection between the emotional upheaval that Silvio felt and his academic trajectory is really quite clear. Ultimately, due to this upheaval, he's actually dropped out of school. In the 10th grade, he got his girlfriend pregnant, and so now they live together, and he works full-time as an unauthorized worker alongside his parents. So for US educators, I think, may find these cases in which separations engender resentment among children even after they're living with their parents. But they also may notice the ways that the threat of deportation leads to high levels of insecurity and anxiety among children in their classrooms, and fears of separation and stigma. The children I met whose fathers who've been deported showed signs of emotional distress. And I say fathers here quite on purpose because men are much more likely to be detained and deported than women are. Even at 3 years old, too young to understand really what happened, according to this mother, a child cried and asked for his dad every time. In Raquel's case, when her husband was detained, she decided not to tell her children what had happened, which was actually pretty typical among the parents I met. But then she caved in and decided to take her 6-year-old to the detention center up in Elizabeth. So then they started going every week, but he started having nightmares. And then one day the school called because he was yelling and screaming that his dad had killed his mom. They put him with the social workers, according to the mom, and they sort of worked this out. And then actually the boy's father was released and was actually living with the family when I interviewed them. But I think it's noticeable in this case how his emotional distress really came out in the school-based setting. That's how the mother found out about it. Aside from the emotional consequences, there are severe economic repercussions for families after a detention or deportation. Being thrust from a family in which a father is the primary wage earner into one in which the mother is the sole provider drastically changes children's lives. One girl I interviewed when she was in the 9th grade started in the 5th grade watching her brother every day after school. She's actually now a senior and she applied for and received DACA. She wants to go to college and would likely get in, but her mother opposes this because now that she has DACA, she needs her to work and help support the family. It's an interesting connection. Beyond these direct impacts, enforcement policies indirectly impacted the children I met, who described many, many fears about deportations, unauthorized children being afraid, US citizen children being afraid, about being separated from their parents. I have so many quotes on this, so I'm just putting up a couple, and I'm not going to read through them. But I think that you can see children are not only afraid of separation, but they talk about immigrants. These are young children, talk to me about immigrants as being people who are not supposed to be here. So children take these fears in their interactions in school-based settings. Children I met told me they hid the place of their birth from other children. A 7-year-old boy I interviewed in Ohio told me he wouldn't want any of his friends to know that he's an immigrant because he'd be ashamed. And even US-born children said the same thing. This 8-year-old girl in New Jersey told me she wouldn't want anyone to know because they'd be mean because she was born in a different place from her mother. A 12-year-old girl, I believe, told me of how she would only tell friends that could keep secrets well. And another boy, aged 10 in New Jersey, said he wouldn't tell anyone because it would spread around the whole school and they would start rumors about him. So it appears that children, due to these fears of immigration, are beginning to show signs of associating stigma with their immigrant heritage. I think this is quite ironic because in the classrooms I was visiting, they were all learning about immigration and Ellis Island in their books, especially in the 4th grade, right? So current immigration policy has really led to different types of family separation. In some cases, children are living in Mexico without their parents due to restrictive policies that make it impossible for families to come together. In other cases, enforcement in the US threatens to separate families while they're together if one member is out of status. We can talk more about the implications of this for schools and Q&A, but I do want to end with a few comments, or am I out of time? I can't remember. Okay, I'm going to take a few seconds. I think in Mexico, educators should be cognizant of the underlying issues that the children are facing. A lot of teachers talked about them having problems, but did not really recognize that these families need extra support and that extra support is not available in the home-based setting. In the US, educators need to be aware of the turmoils that previous separations can have even after their kids are living with their parents again. They need to understand that separations leads to lag in educational progress, both in Mexico, but also post-reunification. Educators in the US also need to be aware of the stress that current enforcement practices are causing children and families. Children are afraid, and they're also afraid to tell anyone they're immigrants, and they're associating stigma with immigration. I think educators have a key role to play in reversing this trend. They can provide a safe space in schools in which children can discuss immigration policies and practices, and that maybe that will ameliorate some of the insecurity children feel on this topic. Schools, of course, can't stop deportations. None of us seem to be able to, how much we talk about it. But educators can highlight the destructive impact policies have on kids in their classrooms. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Veronica Terriquez, and I'm from the University of Southern California. Thank you for being here this morning. I'm also going to continue with the theme of families and immigration, and I'm going to focus on the factors that shape Latino immigrant parents' involvement in their children's schools. So there's a large body of work out there that looks at how parental school participation shapes the outcomes for children, how being involved in PTA meetings, teacher conferences, school events might benefit or not benefit children's academic achievement. But as a sociologist who looks at the political incorporation of immigrants, I think of parental school involvement as a form of civic participation. And civic participation can refer to the communal activities that have some benefit or purpose beyond an individual or family's self-interest. Yes, parent involvement could benefit children. However, when we think about parent involvement more broadly as a form of civic participation, we can also conceptualize how parents being involved in meetings, school reform efforts, or other school activities can actually benefit school programming. In addition to that, when parents are involved and they're immigrants, going to school-related activities could also help develop their social networks with each other. Immigrants could develop relationships with parents who are not immigrants, as well as school personnel, administrators, and other stakeholders. In addition to that, when parents become actively involved, they can also learn civic skills that they could acquire in non-school settings. So for newcomers to this country, a school is a relatively accessible place for immigrants to become oriented to civic participation in the American context. When I think about school participation, I generally think about it in two types. So there's conventional school participation, or what some sociologists might call plug-in participation, that are largely defined and dictated by school personnel. So when there's volunteer activities at the school, when there's parent-teacher association meetings or other school events, teachers, administrators kind of guide parents on what they should do. And in these type of activities, parents don't necessarily have the opportunity to exercise much leadership. They don't always have the opportunity to voice their concerns, but sometimes they do. In addition to that, there's other forms of participation, which I call critical forms of engagement, such as participating in school decision-making meetings, like school site councils, English language advisory committees, and other formal or informal committees in which parents can have a say in how things are run or how budgets are spent in school. In addition to that, parents can become critically engaged when they participate in grassroots organizing efforts or other collective efforts to improve school conditions. And as we all know in this room, schools in Latino immigrant communities tend to be disproportionately overcrowded. There's a lot of teacher turnover, and there's a host of all other range of problems that limit learning opportunities for the children of Latino immigrants. And critical forms of participation can help ameliorate some of these conditions. So before I proceed, I just want to remind you of some demographics. As Doug said earlier, Latinos comprise about 17% of the population. But this population is disproportionately young. So Latino children comprise almost 1 in 4 children in public schools today. That's a really large proportion. And so I think it's really important to understand patterns of participation of their parents in schools. Another important statistic to consider is that most Latino children in the United States, 55%, have at least one foreign-born parent. So we're talking about immigrant families. Because of the immigrant composition of the Latino population in the U.S. today, I find it particularly helpful to draw on research on immigrant incorporation and assimilation in thinking about factors that shape civic participation in schools. So a lot of the research in sociology, I'm a sociologist, really looks at assimilation patterns in terms of educational attainment or labor market outcomes. But I find this immigration assimilation or incorporation framework useful for understanding civic participation. So importantly, parents' human capital or their education in their home country really impacts how well they do in the United States. In addition to that, their English language ability could also shape what happens to them. Time in the U.S., how long people have lived in the United States, often shapes their incorporation patterns. So the longer immigrants have lived in the United States, the more they tend to resemble the native-born population. And as we heard today, legal status can really shape what happens to immigrants when they get here. Being undocumented can hurt their economic prospects, their prospects for social integration, and as Joanna mentioned, the mental health of children in particular. We also see that gender shapes patterns of incorporation. So a lot of the immigration research really looks at how men and women might differ in terms of their educational attainment or in terms of their labor market incorporation. But it also matters, gender also matters for patterns of civic participation. And then an immigrant's race or an ethnicity, what they look like to outsiders can shape what happens. So non-white immigrants sometimes face discrimination when they come to this country. The immigration research also tells us that the local context of reception matters. Where immigrants settle can impact how well they do. So for example, if you come from Mexico and move to Ohio or New Jersey, where Joanna did her study, it's very different than moving to LA, where most or a lot of people look like you and you could blend in. So immigrants' experiences really can vary based on where they live. In addition to that, in places that are more established immigrant destinations, we see a larger civic infrastructure that supports the incorporation of immigrants. So a lot of my work is focused on LA County, and I know LA is very different than other parts of the country, but I think my research in LA can provide some important insights into patterns of incorporation or civic participation more broadly in different parts of the country. So just quickly, I want to give you some quick background information. So Los Angeles is very big, and it's a historic immigrant destination. And today, 1 out of 11 Latino students go to school in LA County, 1 out of 11 in the country. Latino students comprise the majority of students in LA County, 63%, and approximately 2/3 have an immigrant parent. So being able to blend in kind of helps shape the incorporation patterns of immigrants in LA. What I'm going to share with you today is a really brief summary of several studies that I've done on Latino immigrant civic participation. I've published a few articles, and I'm incorporating new research into a book manuscript that talks more broadly about parent civic engagement in schools. So my research draws on the Los Angeles Family Neighborhood Survey, the Los Angeles Parent Engagement Study that I conducted with John Rogers at UCLA, Maritza del Razo, and other people who work for UCLA IDEA. The study includes 1,100 surveys, including 500 randomly selected parents throughout LA County, another 600 who participated in different labor or community organizations. The study includes interviews with representatives of community organizations, labor unions, and so forth. We also surveyed 250 principals and another 200 assistant principals to learn more about parental involvement in LA. And in addition to that, to kind of figure out how things might differ in LA versus other parts of the country, I also use a National Household Education Survey. So I'm quickly going to summarize some patterns of parent civic engagement that I found in my study. So it may not be surprising that Latino parent civic engagement in schools is highly correlated with their level of education attainment. So parents who are a little bit more educated, have graduated from high school, or in some cases, very few have gone to college, those tend to be more involved than parents with less education. What might be surprising, though, is that after I adjust for parental level of education, I see no racial differences between whites and Latinos in terms of patterns of participation. Latino parents are just as invested in their children's schools as similar white parents, and they're about as likely to get involved. Latino parents do often encounter language barriers to being involved in their children's schools, but this isn't necessarily always the case. We surveyed and interviewed quite a number of parents, almost 2/5, who said that they encountered no language barriers when going to school events or school activities, in part because there were adequate translation services, because there were teachers or administrators who spoke their language. When immigrants first get to the United States, they often have to prioritize trying to find a place to live, they're trying to get their bearings, and it's pretty hard for them to become actively involved in their children's schools. But what I found was that after living in the US only a decade, immigrants were just as involved as their native-born counterparts. And so this kind of speaks to schools as a space where immigrants can quickly become involved and learn to become civically engaged. It's kind of like an entry point to civic participation in the US context. One thing that I was surprised by in my study of Los Angeles was that legal status did not shape patterns of participation in schools. And this may be a uniquely immigrant LA story, in part because there's so many undocumented immigrants. Over a third of parents are undocumented among the Latino immigrant population, and the undocumented blend in quite easily with the documented population. In interviews, mothers, fathers told me that legal status, being undocumented, not having papers, wasn't an issue when it came to being involved in their kids' schools. A bigger issue sometimes was work schedules. And finally, I found that, as you might expect, mothers are more involved in their children's schools than fathers, but this does not mean that fathers are absent from the schooling process. Fathers are particularly involved when their partners work. I also found important patterns in which parents become critically engaged when they try to influence school policies or when they try to reform or improve the quality of their children's education. And in particular, I found parents who were involved in civic organizations, activist organizations to be more precise, whether it was community grassroots organizations or activist labor unions. Those parents in particular had problem-solving skills. They learned how to mobilize other parents to address issues such as overcrowding, unclean bathrooms, or sometimes they really try to influence how budgets were spent in their schools. And so, for example, I'll just give you a very quick example. So I interviewed a number of members of the Los Angeles Janitors Labor Union who had been involved in resolving worker grievances at their work site. They had worked with with their co-workers to protest unfair working conditions or to demand higher wages. Those parents took those social movement repertoires, or what's commonly called social movement repertoires, the grievance procedures, the organizing processes, and directly applied them to their children's schools. So individual labor union parents would mobilize other parents who maybe not have necessarily had that same background to address concerns that they had about their children's schools. Similarly, parents who participated in other grassroots community organizations, that we have quite a number of them in Los Angeles, would use those skills to address concerns at their children's schools. So in some cases, parents can be involved or become involved in more transformative forms of civic engagement. So in summary, my research shows that parents do encounter a number of challenges to becoming involved in their children's schools. The key one being the low levels of education, sometimes limited English speaking skills. Although I did find that legal status was not a big issue in Los Angeles, this does not mean that it's not an issue elsewhere. And so in my work, I identify some of the mechanisms that support active engagement among parents. One key thing is a welcoming and non-hostile local context and welcoming school environments. Parents will become involved when they're invited. Co-ethnic or Spanish-speaking people, or people who at least try to speak Spanish to the immigrant parents, really make the parents feel welcome and invited in the school setting. And then finally, community-based organizations, including labor unions, community-based organizations, and even sometimes parent education trainings can help parents become actively engaged in different types of school activities. Thank you.
Well, our panelists have presented work illustrating the perverse and harmful effects of our recent immigration policies and the impact that these policies have on the education of immigrant children. And in my remarks, I'll try to synthesize what we've learned here and draw out the implications for the reform of our public policies. Professor Massey has explained how policies that were intended to restrict immigration from Latin America have instead promoted that immigration and increased the number of unauthorized immigrants by encouraging the unauthorized migration of families with children. Given increased border enforcement, unauthorized immigrants have chosen to stay longer, unable to visit the families they left behind. Many decided to bring those families into the United States, precisely to avoid the hardships associated with separation that Professor Drebe has described. Immigration policies make legal immigration so difficult that many families must choose between separation and illegal immigration. Professor Drebe observes, however, that for families who have moved to the United States, immigration policies may continue to interfere with the education of children because our aggressive deportation policies may separate families by removing immigrant parents of children born in the United States as citizens, depriving those children of the important support that parents provide to the education of their children. Professor Tariquez studies the role that Latino parents play in their children's education through their involvements in their children's schools. And she finds that those who do not speak English tend to be less involved in their children's schools, which may make those schools less responsive to the needs of immigrant children. She also finds that those, surprisingly, although you might think that the fear of discovery and removal would inhibit unauthorized immigrants in particular from civic engagement in their public schools, Professor Tariquez does not find evidence of that kind of chilling effect in her study of Latina mothers in Los Angeles County. And her results suggest that the holding of the US Supreme Court in Plyler versus Doe, which struck down a state law excluding unauthorized immigrants from public schools in 1982, has succeeded in making public schools relatively open and safe places for unauthorized immigrant families, at least in Los Angeles. Professor Gonzalez focuses on a dimension along which the safe haven created by Plyler versus Doe may be limited. This protected space for unauthorized immigrant children lasts only through 12th grade. As these children approach adulthood, their immigration status begins to limit the opportunities open to them. Professor Gonzalez interviews young adult unauthorized immigrant Latinos, and those interviews suggest that these immigrants, after completing their education, find that they do not enjoy the benefits that are expected to flow from that education. The US Supreme Court in 1982 observed in Plyler versus Doe that many unauthorized immigrant children will remain in this country indefinitely. It stressed the costs of an exclusion policy to the innocent children who are excluded, but also to the nation as a whole, and noted how education provides the basic tools by which individuals might lead economically productive lives to the benefit of us all. Well, unfortunately, the US Congress would implement a rather different vision 4 years later in 1986, when for the first time it made it unlawful to employ an unauthorized immigrant knowingly and required employers to verify authorization to work. As a result, Professor Gonzalez finds that most unauthorized immigrants find their employment opportunities limited to a clandestine labor market in which wages are low, regardless of the success that they may have enjoyed in pursuing an education. Professor Gonzalez finds that their lack of legal status blocks the upward mobility that would otherwise flow from their investments in human capital. And this waste of human capital poses a challenge to educators who have to inspire efforts among students who may have little to gain by staying in school and doing well at school. In her study of Latino immigrant parents, Professor Tariquez finds a correlation between the labor union activism of workers and the type of critical engagement with their children's schools that may be most important for making schools responsive to the needs of their children. Her interviews with those parents suggest a causal link and indicate that workers who gain skills and confidence through labor unions may become more vocal and active at their children's schools. Well, if unauthorized status at the workplace inhibits union activity, as labor unions fear, then that effect may translate into less critical engagement with their children's schools, and thus into less responsive schools. So how are we to respond to the various challenges that our immigration policies create for the education of immigrant children? Findings by Professor Gonzalez suggest that it's important for teachers and school staff to develop trusting relationships with students so that they can serve as mentors and provide information about how an unauthorized immigrant can move forward and go to college. Professor Tariquez suggests that we need to reduce language barriers to parent participation through the use of bilingual personnel. Professor Drebe stresses the need for educators to provide extra support to children who may be struggling with the effects of past or present separation from their parents, and proposes that educators discuss immigration policy in class. Above all, however, the findings of our panelists underscore the importance of comprehensive immigration reform, including the legalization of the unauthorized immigrant population as a response to the problems that they identify. Legal status would ease the threat of removal for legalized immigrants, which has created the separations and fears that Professor Drebe suggests undermines the education of the children of immigrants. Professor Gonzalez studies immigrants who have obtained deferred action for childhood arrivals. And his findings suggest that even this limited relief from removal improved their employment prospects and increased earnings by providing employment authorization. And last June, the US Senate passed a comprehensive immigration reform bill that would provide far broader relief than DACA by legalizing many unauthorized immigrants. Legalized immigrants generally would have to spend 10 years in provisional status and would go back to the back of the line for permanent residence behind those who have been waiting patiently for their legal immigration visas. To ensure that our immigration policies do not generate more unauthorized immigrants in the future, we should also liberalize opportunities to enter the United States legally. As Professor Massey observes, restrictionist policies have severely limited the supply of entry visas well below the demand for those visas, causing prospective entrants to give up on legal immigration and turn instead to illegal immigration. And the Senate bill would take several important steps to liberalize the current system for legal immigration. For example, the Senate bill would treat spouses and children of lawful permanent resident aliens as immediate relatives, which would exempt them from quotas entirely. Spouses and minor children of U.S. citizens can already enter as immediate relatives without ceilings. The Senate bill would extend this treatment to the spouses and minor children of legal permanent resident aliens. And that solution would give priority to nuclear families and avoid backlogs for those relatives without taking immigration visas from any other categories. And that reform would allow immigrant families to avoid the hardships imposed by the kind of separation described by Professor Drebe. Professor Massey's work also suggests that it was a mistake to eliminate the Bracero program. Instead, Congress should have enacted reforms to improve wages and working conditions for guest workers. In fact, the Senate bill would create a new non-immigrant visa program for less skilled workers. These W visas would allow workers to enter for a 3-year period and would be renewable. Those visas would allow workers within certain categories to leave one employer and to work for another employer registered with a program. Unlike past programs for guest workers, including the Bracero program, which tied each guest worker to a specific employer. Freedom to leave an employer and to take employment elsewhere would give workers greater power to assert their rights against employers and thus prevent abuses. Professor Massey's work also suggests that we should provide opportunities for legal permanent residence to accommodate the desire of some guest workers to remain. In fact, under the Senate bill, workers on these W visas could apply for permanent residence through a new merit-based point system, which would award points based on various factors, including points for each year spent working lawfully in the United States. So admission as a guest worker need not entail permanent status as an alien. And the flexibility of such a point system is a virtue that might facilitate a political compromise on the path to citizenship for unauthorized immigrants granted legal status. At least some Republicans in the House of Representatives have expressed a willingness to grant legal status to unauthorized immigrants. But they have also objected to the special path to citizenship provided in the Senate bill. A possible compromise would allow legalized immigrants to apply for green cards through the same immigration system that is open to all prospective immigrants. For example, unauthorized immigrants could earn permanent residence through the point system. If Congress liberalizes that immigration system enough so that enough legalized immigrants could have a realistic chance of eventually obtaining green cards and permanent residence, then I suspect we might just have the makings of a compromise that would finally allow comprehensive immigration reform to emerge from Congress.
We got very rich sources of evidence discussed throughout the papers and the comments from Professor Chan. We have a few minutes. I wish we had another 2 hours to engage in a discussion of this information, but I hope that you can connect with the speakers as we finish the session. Let's just, the session is being filmed because it's a presidential session, so I will ask those of you who want to ask questions to come to the mic, and that way we can record the sound. Do we have any questions from the audience? Don't be shy. Please come to the mic.
Thank you for your comments, and it was very helpful to those of us who are on the same side as you in this immigration discussion. My only question was if there was someone who was against the very principles you were talking about, who had that sort of invasion or flood mentality towards immigrants, what would they take away from what you just said? Because on the one hand, it may well be that the plan is working. Am I making too much any sort of cynical sense here? Or?
Anybody? Are you directing the question to a particular person, or should we just ask the panel to respond?
I guess just the panel. I just was worried about what would happen if there was someone who really wanted to keep immigrants in a marginalized position. How would we speak to them? Because in many senses, I felt that you were speaking to those of us who agreed with you.
Okay, thank you.
I don't think immigration policy is that logical. There's a kind of a Marxist type theorizing that employers like this because it keeps a subservient workforce that's accessible but pliable. But if you look at the coalitions, it's not employers who are opposed to immigration reform, and they're not the ones that's blocking it, they're supporting it. The people that are really implacably imposed are people that fall along the same lines as the Tea Party. And this is really, I think, a racial reaction against the changing demography of the United States and the new reality of the United States. And it's paradoxically triggered and exacerbated by the election of a black president. You have to understand that my generation, baby boom, and my parents' generation, when we think back to what America is and what regular Americans are, we think back to 1970 when immigrants were 4.7% of the population, the lowest level ever recorded in American history. And blacks were segregated and out of sight, Latinos were segregated and out of sight, Asians were a tiny population concentrated in a few zones in the West Coast. And now immigrants are a nationwide population. Latinos are 17%, blacks are 13, 14%, Asians about 7%. And less than half of the births are to white European mothers. And people my generation and older are extremely discomfited by these demographic changes and the changing demography of the United States. And their reaction is simply exclusion, prevention, prevent them from voting, prevent them from legalizing, prevent them from getting in. And what I've tried to tell these people is that if your goal is to moderate immigration into the United States, then when it comes to enforcement, less is more. If we'd done nothing at the Mexico-U.S. border and just kept the Border Patrol growing with inflation rather than dramatically increasing it at an exponential rate, we would have fewer Latinos in the United States now, a smaller undocumented population, and less demographic change. It's our attempts to block the inevitable that makes the situation worse and actually produces outcomes that those of us who are racially challenged don't like.
Thank you.
I would also stress to restrictionists the ways in which policies that we have are costly not only to the immigrants but to the rest of us as well. Just to take one example, Professor Gonzalez's findings about how immigrant talent is being wasted because those without legal status can't find employment that actually takes advantage of their skills. That's a waste not only for the immigrant, but for society that loses the benefit of that labor, that skilled labor. One of the reasons that comprehensive immigration reform is thought to produce fiscal benefits is that when unauthorized immigrants are legalized, they find employment that increases their earnings, which means that they'll pay more in income taxes and contribute more to the public treasury. So this reform is not just for the benefit of the immigrants, but for all of us.
Thank you. We have time for one or two more questions.
Hi, I'm Christine Malsbury. I'm at the University of Hawaii, and I do a lot of work on the intersection between immigration and education, and I really appreciate everything everyone had to say. So one of the things I noticed, so it was fabulous work, but one of the things I noticed at the end was a lot of the implications were for educators and how educators can change their practice and how schools can change their practice. And from where I sit in education, what I see is that educators are exhausted. They are undergoing constant criticism, deprofessionalization, and we're once again at this period of bringing in new reform that's leaving out immigrant students and English, as they're termed, English language learners. So, NCLB disaggregated data and put ELs into the spotlight, but at the same time didn't provide anything to support educators to actually do anything about the problem to be solved, right? And then now again, we see in the Common Core that once again, immigrant children and EL youth are being left to the margins. So I guess my question is, most of you are coming from sociology. How can sociologists of immigration push back on education policy so that we can begin to center this population, right? So educators have a lot going on. They've got issues of autism, privatization. So for them, it's a smaller subgroup. I mean, for me, it's huge. For a lot of people, it's a smaller subgroup, and they're like, why should I care? I've got so many other things going on. So how can we really begin to change education policy and center this population?
Thank you. Let's get the next question, and we can get the two questions answered.
And perhaps you can combine the two questions. I'm Beth Dahl. I'm from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, in which a rapid increase in Latino immigration is a relatively new phenomenon, really a couple decades. But I did want to point out to you that we also, 25% of our kindergarten, first grade students are Latino. We have a number of schools in the state that will be 70, 80% Latino, large numbers of undocumented families. Schools are some of the phenomena that you had mentioned and that you thought might be specific to California. Happens in Nebraska too. Schools are our safe haven. We have communities that become highly engaged. So these may be phenomena that are being studied perhaps more on the coast, but we're paying attention, and many of these phenomena are true in Nebraska schools.
Thank you. So we're going to wrap up with these two questions, please.
I really appreciate that point. I think it's an excellent one in terms of school reform. And I think, actually Veronica may have said something that I think is really important about how the local context varies a lot. I've done my research in New Jersey and Ohio and spent a lot of time thinking about this, and it's interesting to think about LA. And I think one potential suggestion is that local communities do come up with pretty good answers when they're able to. And the way I read school reform, at least in New York State where I live, is that's not what's happening, is that our local communities in New York are not being able to make decisions about what happens in classrooms. And I think that, I don't know, like I said, I don't study these things, but that would be my reaction, is that there is, communities do come up with pretty creative solutions. In New Jersey, where the school I was at was 80%, the principals estimated 80% were kids of Mexican immigrant parents. 80% in the middle of New Jersey is very high. And that school actually did not have a lot of teacher turnover. That was one of the schools that teachers wanted to be at because it has this kind of flavor to it where they're actually doing a lot of pretty good work. So I think that local communities, when they're empowered, can come up with solutions. And maybe that's a link where we can push back at some of these stresses that
Veronica,
teachers are.
thank you.
Yes. I want to echo what Joanna was saying. Communities can be resources. You're right. Teachers, educators are overworked, overtaxed. There's so many things going on and their time is limited. And to the extent that community organizations or even churches could be resources, there's opportunities for partnerships to develop so that some of the civic capacity building, some of the support for parents could come from other agencies. And so I've worked in various school districts, and I've noticed a lot of variation. So in some places, the school is walled off from the community. And in those circumstances, families become alienated as well. But there's other places, other schools or school districts that are really open to creating those community school partnerships. And I think to the extent that local policies can create those or facilitate those can make a difference in the types of support educators receive from outside of schools.
We'll end on that hopeful note. We're past our time. I hope that you will connect with our speakers today. Thank you again. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you again for coming, and I hope you will have a great conference.